"What the hell are you doing with that relic, old man?" The voice sliced through the quiet operations room like a blade, sharp and commanding. Colonel Derek Bradford stood near the doorway with his arms crossed, his perfectly pressed uniform catching the overhead lights, his face twisted in obvious disgust. His glare was locked on an elderly man, carefully adjusting a folded tactical map on the planning table. His movements slow and deliberate. Raymond Holloway didn't flinch. His weathered hands, deeply crisscrossed with silver scars that told stories he'd never speak, continued their methodical work. He wore a simple gray maintenance uniform, fabric worn thin at the elbows and knees. At 74, he looked like a forgotten relic in this high-tech facility, dominated by touchscreens and real-time satellite imagery. "We have real-time GPS tactical displays," Bradford snapped, gesturing impatiently at the glowing wall screens. "This isn't some Stone Age bunker. Get that museum piece out of here before General Harrison arrives." Raymond's pale blue eyes, sharp as winter ice, finally lifted to meet the colonel's stare. "The digital system has a 3-second lag on coordinate updates, sir," he said quietly, his voice carrying the faint trace of a Texas drawl. "In combat, 3 seconds means lives." Bradford's jaw tightened. He stepped closer, deliberately invading the old man's personal space. "Your job is maintenance, not tactics. Know your place. Before we continue, if stories of quiet dignity and unsung heroes resonate with you, type honor below. And tell me where you're watching from. This story of Raymond Holloway reminds us that true leadership is earned through service, not demanded through rank. I read every comment." The morning had started like any other at Naval Air Station Oceana. Raymond arrived at 0500, as he had every day for the past 3 years since taking the maintenance position. He swept floors, restocked supply closets, and ensured the operations center was immaculate before the officers arrived. It was simple work, quiet work, a kind of work that let a man disappear into the background. But Raymond Holloway had never been good at staying in the background. Not when something was wrong. The previous night, he'd noticed the lag in the tactical display system while cleaning. He'd watched the coordinates refresh, counted the seconds, and recognized the flaw immediately. It was a small thing, the kind of detail most people would miss. But Raymond had spent 30 years in the Navy learning that small things got people killed. So he'd brought his old map, the same type he'd used in Desert Storm, the edges worn soft from being folded and unfolded 1,000 times. The markings were in his own hand, precise and clear. He'd planned to show the duty officer quietly, to mention the system glitch without making a scene. He hadn't expected Colonel Bradford. Bradford had arrived 2 weeks ago, fresh from a Pentagon assignment, carrying himself with the kind of rigid authority that came from PowerPoint presentations and conference rooms rather than actual combat. He was 42, ambitious, and determined to modernize every aspect of the base. To him, Raymond was just another piece of outdated equipment that needed replacing. "I want that map gone," Bradford continued, his voice rising. "And I want you to understand something. When General Harrison arrives for this briefing, you will stand in that corner. You will not speak. You will not move. You are here to empty trash cans and refill coffee. Nothing more. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Raymond said quietly. Bradford turned to address the room. 3 junior officers had filed in, preparing for the morning briefing. Staff Sergeant Marcus Garcia, a communications specialist, was setting up the encrypted video link. He'd been watching the exchange, his face carefully neutral, but his eyes hard. "Let this be a lesson," Bradford announced to the room. "We don't tolerate outdated thinking here. This is a modern facility. We use modern methods. Anyone who can't adapt should consider finding work elsewhere." Raymond folded his map slowly, his scarred hands moving with practiced care. He placed it in the worn canvas messenger bag at his feet. As he did, Bradford's eyes caught something. A flash of color from inside Raymond's maintenance jacket. A ribbon, small and distinctive, pinned to the inner lining. Bradford's lip curled into a smirk. What's that, old-timer? Some kind of participation trophy from your bingo league? He reached out with 2 fingers and flicked the ribbon. It was a casual gesture, dismissive and cruel. The ribbon was navy blue with a thin white stripe down the center. The Navy Cross, the second highest military decoration awarded for valor in combat. The flick was light, barely a touch, but it landed on Raymond like a physical blow. For a moment, the sterile operations room dissolved. The fluorescent lights became the blazing Iraqi sun. The hum of air conditioning became the roar of burning oil wells. He could smell it, burning fuel, cordite, blood, the sand in his throat. The weight of a body across his shoulders as he ran through a minefield while artillery shells screamed overhead. He was 44 again, not 74. His knees didn't ache. His back was strong. And he was carrying James Harrison's younger brother, Lieutenant David Harrison, through hell itself. "Leave me," David had gasped, blood bubbling at his lips. "You'll never make it with my weight." "Shut up and stay conscious," Raymond had growled, his eyes scanning the sand for the telltale disturbed patterns that meant pressure mines. Step, breathe. Step, breathe. 300 meters to the extraction point. David's blood was soaking through Raymond's uniform. The Iraqi forces were closing in. The rest of his SEAL team was dead. All dead. He was the last one standing, and he was not leaving David Harrison to die in that desert. "Tell my brother," David whispered, his voice fading. "Tell James the first made it out." "You'll tell him yourself," Raymond had promised. But David Harrison died on the helicopter, 17 minutes after Raymond got him aboard. He died holding Raymond's hand, his last words a whispered thanks. The Navy Cross ribbon Raymond wore had been David's, posthumously awarded. James Harrison, then a captain, had given it to Raymond at a private ceremony 5 years later. "He'd want you to have it," James had said, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave him 17 minutes more than he should have had. 17 minutes where he knew he wasn't alone. That's worth more than any medal." Raymond blinked. The memory shattered. He was back in the operations room, Colonel Bradford's contemptuous face inches from his own. "Sorry," Bradford said with mock concern. "Did I mess up your little badge? Maybe you can get it dry cleaned with the rest of the napkins." Staff Sergeant Garcia, standing 20 feet away, felt his stomach turn. He'd grown up in a military family. His grandfather had been a Marine in Vietnam. He'd been raised to respect the ribbons, to understand what each one meant. And he recognized that ribbon. His hands trembled slightly as he continued setting up the video link. He couldn't confront the colonel directly, but he could do something else. Garcia pulled out his personal phone, keeping it low and out of sight. His fingers moved quickly across the screen, typing a message to the general's aide, a commander he'd worked with on previous assignments. "Sir, urgent. Colonel Bradford is in Operations Room C. He just disrespected what appears to be a Navy Cross ribbon worn by elderly maintenance worker Raymond Holloway. Situation escalating. Recommend immediate attention." He hit send and slipped the phone back into his pocket. In the room, Bradford wasn't finished. He'd tasted power, and he wanted more. "You know what your problem is?" Bradford continued, circling Raymond like a predator. "Your generation thinks the world owes you something because you served. But service is service. My service right now, modernizing this base, making it efficient, is just as important as whatever you did 30 years ago." One of the junior officers, a young lieutenant named Chun, shifted uncomfortably. She'd heard stories from her father about Vietnam-era veterans, how they'd been treated when they came home. This felt wrong, deeply wrong. But she was new, junior, and Bradford was a colonel. She stayed silent, hating herself for it. "I want you to understand something clearly," Bradford said, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "When the general arrives, you're invisible. You don't exist. The only time I want to see you is when you're taking out the trash, because that's all you're good for now. Whatever you used to be, you're not anymore. You're just an old man who can't let go." Raymond's pale blue eyes met Bradford's gaze. For just a moment, something ancient and dangerous flickered in those winter sky depths. Something that had survived combat, torture, loss, and 3 decades of classified operations that would never see the light of day. But Raymond said nothing. He simply nodded once, slowly, and turned to pick up a trash bag from the corner. Bradford smiled, satisfied. He'd established dominance. Shown the room who was in charge. He had no idea what was coming. Staff Sergeant Garcia's message had reached Commander Lisa Brennan within 30 seconds. She was in the general's office, preparing the briefing materials for the morning session. When she read Garcia's text, her blood went cold. She knew that name, Raymond Holloway. 3 months ago, when General James Harrison had been reviewing the base personnel files, he'd paused on one particular entry. It was a standard maintenance worker application, unremarkable except for one detail in the veteran status section. "My God," Harrison had whispered, his face going pale. "Sir?" Brennan had asked. Harrison had looked up, his eyes distant. "This man saved my brother's life. I've been looking for him for 3 years." The story had come out slowly. David Harrison, killed in Desert Storm, a SEAL team that had gone in to extract POs from an Iraqi base. The lone survivor who'd carried David through a minefield. Harrison had spent years trying to find the SEAL, but the mission had been classified, the record sealed. He'd only had a first name and a physical description. And now, apparently, that SEAL was working as a janitor at his base. And some colonel was disrespecting him. Brennan didn't hesitate. She picked up the secure line and dialed Harrison's personal cell. He was en route to the base, scheduled to arrive in 15 minutes. "Commander Brennan," Harrison answered immediately. "Sir, we have a situation. It's about Raymond Holloway." There was a pause. "The maintenance worker?" "Yes, sir. According to Staff Sergeant Garcia, Colonel Bradford is currently disrespecting him. Publicly." Garcia mentioned something about a Navy Cross ribbon. The silence on the other end was absolute. When Harrison spoke again, his voice was ice. "I'm 3 minutes out. Delay the briefing. Get Colonel Reynolds to Operations Room C immediately. I want witnesses." "Yes, sir." Back in the operations room, Bradford had moved on to inspecting the coffee station, finding fault with everything Raymond had prepared. "This isn't centered," Bradford said, gesturing at the coffee cups. "And these napkins are folded wrong. Do I need to teach you how to fold a napkin?" Raymond was emptying a small trash can, moving with the same unhurried grace he'd shown since the confrontation began. His face was calm, but Lieutenant Shun noticed something. His hands, scarred and weathered, were trembling slightly. Not with fear, with restraint. She'd seen her father's hands shake like that once, when a civilian had thanked him for his service in a condescending tone at a restaurant. Her father, a decorated Army Ranger, had simply smiled and said thank you. But his hands had shaken with the effort of containing decades of controlled violence. Raymond's hands looked the same. Garcia watched from his position by the video system. His message had been delivered 7 minutes ago. Surely someone would respond. The general had to know by now. Bradford picked up one of the coffee cups and examined it like it was contaminated. "These have water spots. Were you planning to serve the general coffee in dirty cups?" "They were cleaned this morning, sir," Raymond said quietly. "They're not clean enough. Redo them. All of them. And this time, do it right." Raymond set down the trash bag. Without a word, he began gathering the cups, his movements precise and economical. As he worked, the canvas bag at his feet shifted slightly. The top flap fell open, revealing the contents. a folded tactical map, a worn paperback book, and something else that made Garcia's breath catch. A photograph, faded with age, tucked into a clear plastic sleeve. It showed a young Raymond Holloway, perhaps 44 years old, standing in desert camouflage. His arm was around another man in similar gear, both of them grinning despite the harsh environment. But it was the insignia on their uniforms that made Garcia's eyes widen. The SEAL Trident, and not just any SEAL unit designation. Below the trident was a number that made Garcia's heart pound. 6. SEAL Team 6, the most elite special operations unit in the entire U.S. military, the unit that didn't officially exist, the unit that handled the missions that were too dangerous, too sensitive, too impossible for anyone else. Garcia's hands had gone numb. This wasn't just a veteran. This was a legend standing in front of him, being treated like garbage. Bradford was still talking, still finding fault, still asserting his authority over a man who had forgotten more about combat and leadership than Bradford would ever know. And Garcia suddenly understood why Raymond Holloway said nothing, why he simply nodded and complied. Because men like Raymond didn't need to defend themselves. The truth always came out. February 25th, 1991. Kuwait. 0300 hours. The Iraqi base was supposed to be empty. Intelligence had reported that the pose had been moved 3 days earlier, but intelligence was wrong. SEAL Team 6 had gone in anyway, because there was a chance. A 1% chance that American prisoners were still there, and 1% was enough. Raymond Holloway, and a Master Chief Petty Officer, led his 6-man team through the outer perimeter. They moved like shadows, their night vision turning the desert into a green-tinted otherworld. The base was larger than expected. More guards, more lights, more everything. "This is wrong," his point man had whispered through the comms. "We should abort." "We don't abort until we know," Raymond had responded. They'd found the prisoners in the eastern building. 7 of them, including Lieutenant David Harrison, beaten and dehydrated but alive. The extraction should have been simple. Get in, get the PAUs, get out. But then the artillery had started. The Iraqis had been shelling coalition positions 3 miles away. The concussive force of the explosions shook the ground, turned the night into a strobe light hell of fire and smoke. And in the chaos, someone had spotted the SEAL team. What happened next would be classified for the next 3 decades. Raymond's team had fought through 40 Iraqi soldiers to reach the extraction point. They'd lost 2 men in the first firefight. Another had taken a round to the leg, arterial bleeding, and had bled out before they could stop it. By the time they reached the helicopter landing zone, only Raymond and 1 other SEAL were still standing, and David Harrison had taken shrapnel to the chest. The helicopter was landing, rotors screaming, sand blasting everything. The other SEAL was covering their retreat, firing controlled bursts at the pursuing Iraqis. Raymond had David over his shoulders, running through the killing field. That's when he'd seen them, the distinctive mounds in the sand, pressure mines, Soviet-made PMN-2 South, scattered across their path to the helicopter. The pilot was screaming through the radio, 30 seconds. That's all I've got. 30 seconds. Raymond had made a decision. He'd sent the other SEAL ahead with 3 of the POs. Get them out. I'll bring the rest. Chief, you can't go. The SEAL had obeyed, herding the 3 prisoners toward the helicopter through the safe corridor. Raymond had turned to face the 4 remaining posts, including David, single file. Step exactly where I step. Exactly? Understand? They'd nodded, terrified. And Raymond Holloway had walked through a minefield, carrying David Harrison, with 3 other prisoners following in his footsteps, while Iraqi soldiers fired at them from 200 meters away, and artillery shells turned the world into thunder. Step, breathe, step, breathe. His eyes scanned the sand, looking for the patterns, the slightly disturbed earth, the unnatural mounds. One wrong step and they'd all die. Step, breathe, step, breathe. A round hit the sand 3 feet to his left. He didn't flinch. Step, breathe, step, breathe. David's blood was soaking through his uniform, making his grip slippery. Almost there, Raymond had whispered. Stay with me, David. Stay with me. They'd made it to the helicopter with 8 seconds to spare. The pilot had lifted off, while Raymond was still pulling the last prisoner aboard, bullets pinging off the fuselage. David had looked up at him, his face gray with blood loss. Tell my brother I made it out. You'll tell him yourself, Raymond had said. But David Harrison had died 17 minutes later, holding Raymond's hand, his last words a whispered prayer. The mission had been classified immediately. The after-action report had been sealed. The Navy Cross that should have gone to Raymond had instead been issued posthumously to David Harrison, because officially the mission had never happened. But James Harrison, David's older brother, had spent 5 years piecing together the truth. And when he'd finally found Raymond, he'd done something unprecedented. He'd given Raymond the Navy Cross that had been awarded to David, a private ceremony. No records, just 2 men honoring a third who hadn't made it home. This belongs to you, James had said. You gave him 17 minutes more of life. 17 minutes where he knew he wasn't alone. That's worth everything. Raymond had taken the ribbon and pinned it inside his jacket, over his heart, where no one would see it, until Colonel Bradford had flicked it like it was trash. The door to Operations Room C opened with a controlled force that made everyone's head turn. General James Harrison entered first, his 4-star insignia catching the light. Colonel Robert Reynolds followed immediately behind, his face grim. Bradford, who had been in the middle of demonstrating the proper way to arrange napkins, straightened immediately and snapped to attention. General Harrison, sir. We weren't expecting you for another. Harrison's raised hand cut him off mid-sentence. The general's eyes swept the room, taking in everything with the trained observation of a career military officer. His gaze found Raymond Holloway, standing by the trash can with a bag in his hands, and stopped. For a long moment, Harrison just stared. His face was unreadable, carved from granite. Then something shifted in his expression. Recognition, disbelief, and rising fury. Everyone remain where you are, Harrison said quietly. His voice was soft, but it carried absolute authority. Colonel Bradford, front and center. Bradford moved forward, confusion and concern warring on his face. Sir, if this is about the briefing schedule. It's not. Harrison's eyes never left Raymond. He took 3 steps forward, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Then, in a movement that shocked every person present, General James Harrison came to attention. His back went ramrod straight, his chin lifted, and his arms snapped up in the sharpest, most perfect salute any of them had ever witnessed. It was not the salute of a superior to a subordinate. It was the salute of a subordinate to a revered superior. Master Chief Holloway. Harrison's voice was thick with emotion. Sir, it is an honor to see you again. The silence in the room was absolute. Bradford's face went from tan to pale to gray in the span of 3 seconds. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Lieutenant Chun felt tears spring to her eyes, without understanding why. Staff Sergeant Garcia stood at attention, his entire body rigid with vindication. Raymond looked at the general, and in his winter sky eyes there was a profound sadness mixed with recognition. He gave a slow, tired nod, a gesture of acknowledgement from one old warrior to another. Harrison lowered his salute, but remained at attention. Then he slowly turned his head to face Colonel Bradford, and the temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. Colonel Bradford. Harrison's voice was no longer warm. It was ice, pure Arctic ice. Do you have any idea who you've been speaking to? Bradford stammered. Sir, he's maintenance staff. He's maintenance staff, Harrison repeated, his voice dangerously soft. Let me educate you, Colonel, since your command training was clearly inadequate. Harrison turned to address the entire room, his voice taking on the tone of a historian reciting sacred text. This is Master Chief Petty Officer Raymond Holloway, United States Navy, retired. Though retired is the thinnest of cover stories. Harrison's voice rose, filling the room. This man was a founding member of SEAL Team 6. Before that, he was underwater demolition. He was part of Operation Eagle Claw in Iran. He spent 3 years operating behind the Iron Curtain, extracting assets the CIA had written off for dead. Harrison paused, letting the weight settle. In the intelligence community, they didn't use his name. They called him the Ghost. He would lead missions so deep, so classified, that the official reports would simply state the objective was achieved by unforeseen circumstances. Harrison pointed at Raymond, his hand trembling slightly with emotion. This man has more confirmed combat missions than anyone in this room will ever see. He's been wounded 23 times. He's been captured twice and escaped both times. He speaks 5 languages fluently and has skills in areas I'm not cleared to discuss. Harrison's eyes locked onto Bradford with laser intensity. And that participation trophy you felt entitled to touch? That county fair prize? His voice dropped to a lethal hiss. That is the Navy Cross, one of the highest military decorations for valor in combat. A second gasp rippled through the room. Harrison continued, his voice shaking now with barely contained rage. It was awarded posthumously to my younger brother, Lieutenant David Harrison, for his actions during a classified mission in Desert Storm. A mission where he was held as a prisoner of war. A mission where he died from his injuries. The general's voice cracked. And the man who carried my brother through a minefield under enemy fire, the man who gave David 17 more minutes of life, the man who held his hand as he died, is standing right there. Harrison turned back to face Raymond, and there were tears in the general's eyes now. David's last words were, "Tell my brother I made it out. You kept your promise, Master Chief. You told me. And then you disappeared." Raymond's weathered face showed emotion for the first time. His jaw tightened. His eyes glistened. But he still said nothing. General Harrison turned back to face Colonel Bradford, who looked like he might collapse. The colonel's entire body was trembling, his face ashen, his carefully constructed authority shattered into a million pieces. "Colonel Bradford," Harrison's voice was cold and final. "You will listen carefully to what I'm about to say, because I will only say it once." The room was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like thunder. The Navy Cross that you flicked like it was garbage represents a sacrifice you cannot begin to comprehend. That ribbon represents my brother's life. It represents 7 prisoners of war who came home to their families. It represents a SEAL team that gave everything in service to this nation. Harrison took a step forward. Bradford instinctively stepped back. But more than that, Colonel, it represents a level of character and honor that you have clearly never understood. Master Chief Holloway could have spent the last 3 years telling everyone who he was. He could have demanded recognition. He could have used his history to gain advantage. Harrison gestured to Raymond, who still stood quietly by the trash can. Instead, he chose to serve in the humblest way possible, to do the work that needed doing without asking for glory. That, Colonel, is what real leadership looks like. That is what real service looks like. Bradford's voice was barely a whisper. "Sir, I didn't know." "That's exactly the problem." Harrison's voice cracked like a whip. "You didn't know. You didn't bother to know. You saw an old man in a maintenance uniform and decided he was beneath you. You saw a ribbon and mocked it without understanding what it meant. You operated on assumption and arrogance instead of respect and humility." Harrison turned to his aide. "Colonel Reynolds, Colonel Bradford is hereby relieved of his command, effective immediately. He will be transferred to an administrative position at the Pentagon, pending a formal review of his conduct. His field command privileges are revoked." "Yes, sir," Reynolds said, his voice grim. Bradford looked like he'd been struck. "Sir, please, my career." "Your career," Harrison interrupted, "is experiencing a course correction. Consider this a learning opportunity, Colonel. You're not being court-martialed, though I have grounds to pursue charges under U.S. Code Title 18, Section 704, for disrespect to a Medal of Honor recipient and Navy Cross recipient." Bradford's eyes widened. "I didn't know about a Medal of Honor." "Because you didn't ask," Harrison said flatly. "Colonel Reynolds, escort Colonel Bradford from this room. He has 24 hours to submit his transfer paperwork." Reynolds stepped forward, and Bradford, his shining career reduced to rubble, was led toward the door. He cast one last look back at Raymond, his face a mixture of shame and disbelief. The door closed behind them. Harrison turned back to Raymond, and his expression softened immediately into something approaching grief. "Master Chief Holloway, I am so sorry. I had no idea you were working here. We can arrange proper recognition, a position more suited to your—" Raymond held up one scarred hand, and the 4-star general fell silent. The old SEAL's gaze drifted across the room and settled on Staff Sergeant Garcia, who was still standing at attention. Raymond gave him a small smile, a look of profound gratitude that made Garcia stand a little taller. Then Raymond turned back to Harrison. When he spoke, his voice was not angry or vindicated. It was gentle, tired, and filled with a wisdom that seemed to come from the earth itself. "He's just young, James," Raymond said quietly, using the general's first name, "full of pride and noise, the way we all were once. The uniform, the rank, the technology, it can make a man forget what's important, make him think respect is something he can demand instead of something he must earn." Raymond walked over to his canvas bag and pulled out a worn thermos. He unscrewed the cap, and the rich aroma of coffee filled the room. "The lesson is more important than the punishment," Raymond continued. "You break a man completely. You just create bitterness. But if you teach him, if you let him learn humility, you might save an officer. That's better service to this country than ending another career." Harrison stood speechless. Here was a man who had every right to be vengeful, to demand retribution. Yet he chose mercy and instruction. "Master Chief," Harrison said, his throat tight, "you're a better man than I am." Raymond poured coffee into a simple ceramic mug. "I'm just an old sailor who knows that everyone deserves a chance to learn." He held the mug out to the general. Harrison, a man who commanded global military power, reached out with both hands and accepted the humble offering. His hands trembled slightly as they closed around the warm ceramic. "Thank you," Harrison whispered. 3 months later, Colonel Derek Bradford sat in a Pentagon office, reviewing logistics reports. It was tedious work, far removed from the command position he'd held at Naval Air Station Oceana, but it was also educational. On his desk sat a framed photograph. It showed Bradford standing next to Raymond Holloway, both of them in front of the SEAL Memorial in Virginia Beach. Raymond's hand was on Bradford's shoulder. Bradford's eyes were clear, humbled, and learning. After his relief of command, Bradford had done something unexpected. He'd requested permission to meet with Raymond Holloway privately. The meeting had lasted 4 hours. Raymond had shared stories, not of his heroism, but of his mistakes, his regrets, his learning. The hardest part of leadership, Raymond had told him, is remembering that everyone you meet is carrying a burden you can't see. Your job isn't to add to that burden, it's to help them carry it. Bradford now volunteered 3 weekends a month at a veteran center, listening to stories, learning history, understanding sacrifice. He was a different man, quieter, more thoughtful, better. At Naval Air Station Oceana, Raymond Holloway continued his maintenance work. But now, when he walked through the halls, people nodded. They knew. Not everything, much of his history would remain classified forever, but enough. Staff Sergeant Garcia had been commended for his actions. Lieutenant Chun had found her voice, and now spoke up when she witnessed injustice. The junior officers who'd been in that room on that day had learned the lesson they would carry for the rest of their careers. And General James Harrison had coffee with Raymond once a month, two old warriors sharing silence and understanding. The legend of that day echoed through the halls of the base for years, a quiet but powerful reminder that heroes are not defined by the shine on their boots or the rank on their collar, but by the dignity of their service. Real leadership is earned, real respect is given, not demanded. And sometimes the most important lessons come from the quietest voices. To everyone who typed honor and shared where you're watching from, thank you for recognizing those who serve in silence. Subscribe for more stories of unsung American heroes who prove that true greatness needs no announcement. See you in the next one.